Welcome back to another episode of Grieving and Growing. I am Denisha Ross Smith, and I am joined today by my sister, Lakeisha Ross, and our wonderful guest, Melissa Waller. Melissa Waller hails from Flint, Michigan. She is the eldest of 4 children and a devoted mother to 1 teenage daughter. As an accomplished global visionary, collaborative thought leader, counselor educator, and engaged community stakeholder with 20 plus years of experience managing executive programs in the nonprofit sector, K through 12 education, topics around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, social emotional learning, mental health, counseling, advocacy, community outreach, while being a contributor for various publications, she has managed to find balance within her journey with grief, all while having earned multiple nominations, awards, and recognition for her civic service, leadership, research, and philanthropic heart. Melissa is deeply committed to advancing the mental health field and research amongst women, specifically Black women, in grief. In specific civic organizations she serves, such as Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Incorporated, National Coalition of 100 Black Women, and Jack and Jill of America, Incorporated, she has sat on specific committees organizing support groups around grief during the pandemic. Personally and professionally, she has a data-driven approach to leadership and research while allowing the quantitative and qualitative reports to support her management approach with full-time professionals. These professionals and counselors in training are creating, implementing, and soliciting resources to support strategic plans focused on various therapeutic programming, stewardship, advocacy, and appropriate career placement for all. Melissa obtained her Bachelor of Arts in Deaf Education and Mathematics, along with earning an educational certificate in urban leadership from Michigan State University, a Master of Arts in Deaf Education, Instructional Leadership from Gallaudet University, a Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling, and she is currently a doctoral candidate in the counselor education and supervision at Mercer University, where she is also an adjunct professor. Melissa is adept at developing impactful policies, best practices, and guidance in the public sector, nonprofit organizations, K through 12, and higher education.
So, all right, let's get into it, ladies, because I know we talked a little bit before we hit record, and we're all excited and a little bit emotional. So let's just get into it. I'm going to kick it over to my sister to get us started.
Again, thank you so much for being here. We are eternally grateful. I'm excited to hear your story. I'm excited for the listeners to hear. I know they're going to be blessed. We love to open the podcast with this single question. When was the first time you experienced grief?
So the first time that I experienced grief, I was 4 years old when my parents got divorced. And that grief is called disenfranchised grief. That's where it's kind of spread out. You don't talk about it publicly. It was a very private manner. My parents got divorced in, I want to say 1985. So at that point in time, I am from Flint, but I was actually born in East Lansing. And so for me, I can remember like the day that my dad left. I remember the day that we moved. It was very traumatic. And, when we have trauma experiences, we remember specific things that we hold on to. I can remember we moved and we left my We Are the World poster in Trappers Cove. And I was just devastated. I was devastated. So we moved from what I knew as my home in East Lansing to Flint. And we went from, having that disenfranchised grief to what we call situational homelessness. And, in our culture, we don't talk about that. That's something that
not at all.
And so when you look at school districts, oftentimes they will categorize situational homelessness as when you live with relatives.
Yes.
And so for a short period of time, we lived with my grandparents until my mother got her home, and then we moved. But it was very devastating. It was very devastating for me. And I can remember just kind of not really knowing what was going on. Like, I can remember I started school early because my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, I can remember her saying, that girl can read. So y'all don't need to pay for her to go to daycare. We're going to send her to school. I was a little girl. So my norm of getting up, going to kindergarten, my mom worked for MEA, and so she would drop me off. My schedule now changed. And now, my grandfather was taking me to school, and I kind of had to wait. Different relatives would pick me up after school. So for me, and nobody, I didn't know what was going on. Like, I knew my dad lived at one place and my mom lived somewhere else. But nobody ever explained to me what that meant, like for someone to be divorced. So I remember being a small child, and even though my grandmother showered me with love, my home dynamic was different. And I didn't really know what was going on. Was I the person? Was I the reason why this happened? Or, what kind of happened? And that's a cultural dynamic that still today we really don't talk a lot about with our children.
So it's true. It's like we want our children to be seen, not heard. We don't want to, just do as I say. Don't ask questions. And so
and don't talk about it outside of here.
Yeah,
and
like
you don't talk about it outside of here.
That's
what happened in this house stays in this house.
In this house. That's right. Absolutely.
And I didn't know what was going on. Like, I didn't know. I just knew, like, everything kind of changed, and it wasn't quote unquote bad, but the dynamic was different. I still saw my dad every day. We just had a totally different environment. And my mother, I had a new baby. I had a new baby sister. So, on top of that, the home dynamic changing, we also had a new child. So that was really the root of where the relationship between my grandmother and my mother and myself being formed.
Yeah.
That's powerful.
So I know the loss of your grandmother was something that you had to grow through. Can you talk to us about your grandmother and how losing her has impacted you?
Oh my gosh. I can talk to you for days about my grandmother. So my grandmother was the rhythm to my heartbeat. She, when they talk about familial dynamics, there is a space in place when we talk about child development where, when children are younger and they attach. And because my grandmother, I was so young when my parents got a divorce, my natural attachment, because my mother was caring for my sister, I knew that my mother was my mother, but my natural attachment being so young became to my grandmother, because she was the person while my mother was kind of, she had a brand new baby, my grandmother kind of just raised me. We were all in the house together. And so she did things for me. And that dynamic, it was that way for a very long time. Until my mother, kind of got settled within having a new baby. Even though we moved, my grandmother had always been my person. If I got sick at school, they called my grandmother. If in the morning, because my mother was trying to figure it out, my parents and my grandmother kept my parents together. My parents met in 7th grade. So my grandmother had known my father all his life. So my maternal grandmother kept that root, that foundation, the spirituality, we're going to be a family. Everybody's going to sit down. And when I tell people about my co-parenting situation, that my parents got along, that was because of my grandmother. My grandmother didn't have it any other way. She knew my paternal grandmother. They were friends. And she felt like these kids aren't going to be impacted by your decisions. So we're going to make it work. She was my everything, my everything. When my grandmother passed, and the crazy thing about it is I knew that my grandmother was passing. So my grandmother passed from, well, allegedly, we'll put allegedly on there, the lead in the water. So she had a blood clot. And I was sitting with her, and it was over holiday. We were watching the football games and all that good stuff. And I just couldn't leave. Something about it. She kept saying, you need to get on the road. You need to go home. I took off work. I said, I don't know. I don't feel right about leaving. And when I went to leave, I gave her the longest hug. And I was holding on to her so tight. And I can remember just the tears coming down my face. And we never, as many times as I have driven from Atlanta to Flint, I've never cried because she's going to talk to me all 12 hours back to Atlanta.
Yeah.
But this time it was a little different. And she said, what is wrong with you? And I just couldn't let her go. And in all my life, I've only seen my grandmother cry 3 times. When her father passed, when her brother passed, and on this day. And my mother was walking in the house and she said, what is wrong with that? I mean, we were just standing there just hugging and crying. And my mom was like, you need to go. She kept saying, you know, Misty, you got to go. You got to leave here. And I just said, I'm not ready. I said, I love you and you mean the world to me and I need you. And she just broke down and she cried and we were just standing there and Milan and my mom were looking at me like, what is wrong with y'all? But that's how connected we were.
Right.
Yeah.
And I got on the road and I was driving back to Atlanta and we talked. And she said, she said, it's something that I just don't, she said, I don't know what it is. And I said, me too. I said, but you know, I love you. She said, I know without a shadow of a doubt. Get back to Atlanta, long story short. Make it in, put Milan in the bathtub. She calls me and she says, hey, I want to tell you something. And I said, what? She said, I want you to know that you are a dynamic mother and don't ever let anybody tell you anything. She said, you're not just a good mother, you're a great mother. You give that girl your all and everything that I've taught you, you have put into her. And I used to call her Lucy. I said, Lucy, what's wrong with you? Why are you telling me this? And she said, I don't know. Next day, got up. Usually I talk to her in the morning, talk to her 6 o'clock in the morning every day. Didn't hear from her. And when I didn't hear from her, by noon, I told my friend, I said, I hope nothing has happened to my grandmother. So I called my mom and I said, hey, where's Granny? And she was like, she probably went to get her hair done. I said, no, this is not her time to get her hair done. Like, we talk to each other all day. And she was like, she's okay, Melissa. I said, no, you need to get up and go over there because something is wrong. So she got up and she called me back maybe 5 minutes later and she said they found her on the floor. So it was a short period of time, but we were so connected from a small child. Like and my mother is very clear. I can remember talking to my mother because I was just so distraught. Like I just couldn't shake it. And she said, it feels like your mom passed. And I said, it does. I said, Mommy, I don't mean any disrespect because my mother did raise me. My mother did raise me. I'm not going to sit up here and say that my parents didn't raise me, but I come from a generation, and you all know of this, where your grandparents were just like your parents.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Because
so
that's how we felt
like I had an extra parent, and my parent passed.
Yes. Wow. I mean, I can relate to so much of what you're saying. The 6 o'clock in the morning conversations, all of it, and just having someone who plays such a significant role in raising you. But it's beyond that. Y'all were friends.
Yeah.
Let me tell you something. If I knew your business, my grandmother knew your business. My grandmother, and I didn't realize until my grandmother transitioned that some of my friends, I hadn't given them an opportunity to be my friend because my grandmother was my best friend. I talked to my grandmother about men, parenting, school, you name it. My grandmother is the reason I got into the PhD program.
You have to tell us that story, Melissa. I know you and I have talked about that, but you have to tell them about the opportunity that you had in front of you and your grandmother was like, absolutely not. You're not doing that.
Yes, let me tell you something. My grandmother, it's a lot of decisions, and my mother gets so upset, but there are a lot of decisions that have been made in my family, and my grandmother was the root of it. Because I don't care anything about it is you think somebody with a 7th grade education, like, but she was on top of everything. She knew how to read, how to write, what was going on. She took care of business. And so I had the opportunity to go and work for the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls in South Africa. So I told her, I was like, you know, Granny, I got this opportunity. And she was like, well, if you gonna go on over to Africa, you're gonna leave that baby here. You're not taking that baby over to Africa with you. I said, no, I'm taking my baby with me. And she was like, well, this is how I feel. I don't have no doctors in my family. And you've always talked about going back to school to become a doctor. Just go back to school. Just do that. You don't have to go across the country and do all that other stuff. You can do that later. Right now, you just need to go ahead and go to school. That's what you do. She said, and if you go to school, then I'll keep your baby for you. So I made the decision to go back and pursue my doctorate. And I said, well, I have my master's is in educational leadership, but I was trying to do some other work in counseling. And she said, well, just send your baby to me. So every summer I sent Milan to Michigan from May until the end of August. She kept her. And that's how I ended up in the PhD program.
Wow.
Just amazing. Just the whole trajectory of your life changed in that one conversation. And now you're working on your PhD. And can you tell us what you're studying and what your degree is going, what your dissertation is going to be in?
Absolutely. And the crazy thing about it is after she passed, I didn't know how to make decisions. We can talk about that. Now you got the counselor going back to school for counseling, and I didn't know how to make decisions, you know, because my grandmother was the deal breaker. You know, we were going to talk about it. We were going to go to God. Then the next morning, we are going to talk about what somebody heard from God, what she heard and what I heard. Yes. And then a decision was made. And so, you know, my doctorate is in counseling, education, and supervision. And as I shared, I'm studying grief. I'm studying grief and the impact it has on Black culture, specifically Black women. Because when I look back over my life, and even my grandmother, the thing about it is my grandmother, she passed the second year I was in the program. I got into the program. She was so excited. Baby, she was calling everybody in Vidalia, telling them, Miss Tina got into the program. She get her doctor. I have a doctor in my family. And she was so excited. And she kept saying, when are you going to be finished? And I was like, Granny, like, this is my second year. Like, I'm just taking my classes. Once I'm finished, she said, I need you to hurry up. And so for me, that's what lets me know that she knew, because that wasn't my grandmother's first time being ill.
Right.
Yeah, gotten ill before, and she was in a coma. She was in a coma. And when she went into the coma, we just prayed. Oh my gosh, I don't think I've ever prayed that hard for that long or fasted that, because I was like, Lord, just give me a little bit more time with her. Just give me a little bit more time with her. And one day my mom said she was sitting in the room with her and she just sat up. And when I talked to her about her journey or her story, she told me that while she was in the coma, she saw her mother. And my grandmother lost her mother in her 20s. So at this point in time, she was in her 80s. And when she told me that, I was like, oh my gosh, I know if she gets sick again, like, she ain't coming back, because she was so excited. Like, I saw both of my parents, and she was like, but I could hear y'all praying for me. Like, I could hear it. It was so loud. And, I said, girl, I'm glad you didn't go towards the light. If we just laughed. But that made me, my grandmother's experience, and a lot of, in Black culture, we don't like to talk about this, but my grandmother's experience is what made me take a deeper dive into spirituality, like what happens in between that time, because she was so adamant about what she saw that it made me look at death not as dying, but as transitioning, another connection, you know, because she was just so excited about seeing her mom again, you know. And so for me, although I miss her with my whole heart, I don't know what it would be like to have my mom pass in my 20s and not see them again, you know. And so that's where that empathy and compassion comes from her. She gave us 80 years, 80 good years.
Yeah.
Yes. That has to give you peace, and I can feel it when you talk about it. You know, definitely you miss your grandmother, but I also feel like joy from you, Melissa. Like, that's where I'm trying to get to, you know, where I can just be in a space of joy, because I feel like that's where you are. How is it going through this whole doctoral program, working on your PhD, knowing this is something that she wanted for you, and she's not here to witness?
Well, it's been tough. I mean, after she passed, I was gonna quit. Like, I was done. I was like, she's gone. Like, what am I supposed to do? You're talking about going to school. I couldn't even figure out, you know, how to talk to the teacher, because my grandmother just wasn't my grandmother. She was my friend. She was my companion. If something happened at the school, she would be calling the school from Flint to Atlanta, talking to the people at school. You know, if something happened, my grandmother called my department chair. And she talked to him. That girl, I think you're out there giving them too much homework. I said, you can't call the university. You can't call the university and talk to me. And so I wanted to quit, because just trying to figure out who I was in this space and place, it was tough, because so much of my day involved my grandmother. So I had to figure out, because the research says that when you are that connected to people and you've been that connected for a long time, the likelihood of you transitioning or something happening, it increases. So that's why when you see people who have been married 50, 60 years, 1 year, one spouse passes, and they have a 2 to 5 year window between something happening to the next person, because you're so connected. So I knew I had to do something. I knew I couldn't just let myself just kind of go down this whirlpool. And we were all trying to figure it out. Nobody knew what to do. My mother, her siblings, none of the cousins, because my grandmother didn't have to have friends because she had us, you know? And so in figuring out what was my next step in this journey, you know, I kind of leaned into my dissertation chair. And so in leaning into him, you know, that was one of my coping mechanisms in dealing with the grief. Was I just dove straight. I kind of made my mind up, you know, my friends, and what the blessing in all of this. Because my grandmother used to say, I want you to find a lesson in the blessing in everything. I grew up with friends in my circle that had lost parents or grandparents. Like one of my childhood best friends, she lost her mom at 10 and her grandmother at 14, 15. So she knew how I felt. It wasn't an understanding. She knew that pain that I felt. You know, I had another best friend that I've kind of always been around, when I thought about it, people who had lost some type of parent. When I look back on it, so I had people who would say, you know, that's not what your grandmother would want you to do. She wouldn't want you to quit. This is what you were going to do. And it was so crazy. My cousin Toya, she works in higher ed now, but when her dad passed right after she defended. And so he didn't get a chance to see her walk across the stage. And she talked to me about that feeling, you know, and what that felt like, but what crossing the finish line meant. And so those are the people that were pouring into me and kind of praying for me and just seeing about me. But my dissertation chair, he just loved on me. He was an old guy that just was like the guru of all things in counseling. And he helped me get back on the right track. And whereas I didn't know what to do with Milan had never been in Michigan, been in Georgia over the summer because she had always went and spent the summers with my grandmother. So she was like, it's hot here. I hate it. I can't do, because she had never spent a summer in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, bring her to class. When you teach, he said, just put her in the podium. So she would stay in the podium and I would teach. She had her iPad and her headphones and she would be okay. And he kind of coached me through it. So he and my grandmother were my greatest cheerleaders. And through that process, he ended up passing. So now I found myself mourning my grandmother, my two biggest cheerleaders. Mm-hmm. And yes, my parents were in my corner. And yes, I had a village, but it's nothing like wisdom. Mm-hmm. I like elderly people. I like wisdom because you can have, as my grandmother would say, all the book sense in the world. But if you don't have common sense, you can't go far. And so I didn't know what to do. Mm-hmm. And I tell people right now, I was actually done with my coursework in 2 years. Mm-hmm. But I have been in the program. I am going into my 7th year because grief would not allow me to move forward. How do I write about grief? How do I teach about grief? How do I talk about grief when I am grieving myself? Right. It makes it real. It makes it relevant. But it also puts me in a space and place where I had to be vulnerable, not just to myself, but to my research. I really knew what that book was talking about. Mm-hmm. I really knew when it talked about the symptomology. I would stay busy. Mm-hmm. I found time to do everything else, get all the awards, but I wouldn't touch the dissertation because my two biggest cheerleaders who really wanted me to do this work for me, they're no longer there. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's easy when people say, well, sometimes you got to cheer for yourself.
Yeah.
Easier said than done.
Easier said than done.
It's not.
Easier said than done. And so I have had, I love Dr. Williams. His name was Dr. Arthur Williams, and I loved him to pieces. Mm-hmm. He was my world. His son was one of the band members in Casting Crowns. Mm-hmm. Oh. So he would often give me, worship songs to listen to. When I had to figure it out, like what were the next steps? Most of your advisors will redirect you back to whatever plan you written out, but he redirected me back to Jesus because he understood in order for me to get to where I had to get to, I was going to need more than just encouraging words. So he put people around me that just loved on me, and when I say loved on me, they were trying to figure out, okay, where are you? What can we do? What's going on? How is it going? And I will forever, he often reminded me of, okay, what would your grandmother say? Because again, now she called up to Mercer University like she was calling up to Whittier Middle School.
Yeah.
And, she didn't care anything about FERPA or anything else. You gonna talk to me about my granddaughter.
Yeah.
And so, not having them physically here has definitely been an adjustment.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that my grandmother used to always say is, know that you're covered. Even when I ain't here, I'm going to be here.
Mm.
And when the scripture tells us that he releases his angels to keep us in all our ways, I can now count her as one of those. So that's where I find peace. That's where I find joy. It's the little things that I reflect on.
Mm.
Being in the car, just laughing. My mom, we were talking a couple of days ago about how you can ride in the car. None of us, my mom was saying everybody's lungs used to get cleared because my grandmother had asthma. So she used to use Primatene Mist and she never put the inhaler in her mouth. She would just squirt it. And so if the heat was on, you got a whiff of it, everybody. Or how I rear my daughter. People will say, I had one of my girlfriends, she said, you will wear anything in your sister. Y'all curvy. And that's because of my grandmother. My grandmother would say, girl, let me see. She had like this little, y'all know the old school plastic runners.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
So she had that plastic runner. She would say, come on and model for me. Mm-hmm. Let me see what it looks like. Let me see. Now turn around. No, you're not doing it the right way. Let me show you. She said, God knew not to give me no big, pretty legs like that. So there was confidence.
Mm-hmm.
That, she just exuded confidence for somebody to be 5 feet, almost 300 pounds. You couldn't tell her she wasn't fine. Just period.
Yeah.
And so she would say, when you know, you know. Mm-hmm. If you know, you know. And can't nobody take away the fact that you do know. Mm-hmm. So those are things that keep me. They comfort me. One of the things that I'm really reflective on when I take deep dives, like just in studying grief and studying spirituality and death and transitioning and understanding that, throughout my life, what happened with my grandmother. So my grandmother passed. We had some other things go on. My grandfather passed. We had the pandemic. I ended up getting 2 different strands of COVID and I almost passed. Mm-hmm. And then my dissertation chair passed. Mm-hmm. So those are considered compound grief phases, like where the grief just keeps piling up.
Yeah.
It's just one thing after another, And someone said, how do you do it? Mm-hmm. How do you I can remember just trying to figure out, like trying to see about my daughter because it's just the 2 of us. So she was so used to it just being us. Mm-hmm. And she's like, I remember when my grandmother passed, she just had a meltdown. You don't even know how to cook. You can't cook. Who's going to make my biscuits? And she was in 1st grade. So she was a little girl and she was trying to figure it out. And there were so many things going on. And even with me being sick and being in the hospital almost 90 days, I had to figure it out. And I put my own stuff on the back burner. Mm-hmm. So I started dealing with everybody else's stuff. And I started zipping up everybody else and making sure everyone else was good. However, I forgot to check back in with myself. Mm-hmm. So my grief didn't always show up like this. It didn't always show up as joy. Yes. Sometimes it showed up being curt.
Yeah.
Sometimes if I didn't feel like being bothered, because we're taught, you hold it together. You got it together. Like I said, on the years I was with my grandmother, I only started crying 3 times. Mm-hmm. Make sure you have this, make sure your house is cleaned up, make sure. And so I just had so many check boxes that I felt like I needed to do. Make sure my house was clean, make sure my daughter was good, make sure my work was done, make sure I got the stuff done at Mercer, but I never checked in with my own heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to, and even I was teaching counseling. I was teaching it, but I was going through the motions. And so, I got a what's called a heart coach. And I got with someone that worked with me and being a heart coach. I call her my godmother, Alina Edmondson. She does a lot of work around the heart and internally. Like, what are we receiving? What's the narrative that we're telling ourselves? Because I wanted to show up differently. I wanted to show up in all the ways that my grandmother had taught me. My grandmother was a pleasant and kind woman, but I was showing up in a whole different way. And I had to release the biggest challenge that I had throughout this journey was releasing the fact that she wasn't physically here anymore. Once I released that, my life got lighter. My life got lighter. But I saw it now as her transitioning on the other side. And I tell people, I don't know what your beliefs are, but for me, I accept the fact that she is now one of my angels. And just I know how hard she fought for me here on earth. My mother couldn't say anything bad about me. She would say, don't you twist your lips to say nothing. That's my girl, And that was all of us. So if she went that hard for me on this side, then God, how is she protecting me on the other side?
Yes. Wow.
Melissa, you said something, and you said something, and I wanted to travel back to it because you were talking about how you're able to, right before you spoke about her being an angel. And I just wanted to know more details about how, because that sounds like the growth part. And I know it's the knowledge of it that she is on the other side and she's, advocating and working on your behalf. But what does that look like day to day, bringing that, making sure that stays at the forefront so that you stay in this place of what clearly is coming through this monitor as joy? Like day to day, I'm thinking, I wake up and it's like, I just got to get off this bed today, and it's still a struggle. It's still a struggle for me. And, it's you've gotten to a place where I think Keisha and I are, we desire a place where we desire to be. And just like, what does that look like? What does that look like day to day? I would love to know more about that, what that looks like.
Well, my grandmother would always say, you got work to do. That was her answer. You got work to do. Why if she called me, and the craziest thing is she would call me and I'm like, I'm at work. So what you calling? So she would call and she would say, well, what you doing? I said, well, I'm working. Well, how you talking to me? I know you got work to do. So that never left. I was there. So my grandmother, it's been 7 years since she's transitioned. Dr. Williams passed this summer. With my grandmother was so big on, and people will say, I've heard people say this to me before. Now, if you want me to get you all the way together, you go ahead and say something about that Milan Waller, honey. My grandmother's identity was in being a woman and being a mother. Now, you could be whatever you want to be, but you was going to serve God. And you were going to make sure that you were kind and you were pleasant and you presented yourself like a woman, quote unquote. And when you became a mother, you nurtured your child. So in the essence of my being, when I laid down on days that it was hard, I often thought about someone who lost their mom in their 20s, moved to Flint, 19 years old, right? Back then, it wasn't long distance and all of that. They were just writing letters. You know, we're talking about 1955. And I would think, how did she go without her mom? You know, her mom died in her 20s. So for 60 something years, and then she had a sister that lived in Flint, but she didn't learn how to drive until like the late 80s. So how did, like, what kept her? And I asked her that, and she would say Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she always prayed to make sure she had good strength and in her right mind. And on days when it got too hard, I thought about her. I got one kid. I have one child. My grandmother had 4 children, and they were stair-step kids. So while I'm sitting up here thinking that my stuff is hard, how did she figure it out? Like, how did she get? I was used to calling her. She didn't have anybody to call. So it transitioned my heart from loss to gratitude. Man, I'm thankful I had you. Or some days I'm like, Granny, what am I supposed to do? Like, I will literally say that out of my mouth. I don't know what to do. Show me, send me a sign, let the light blink, do something, because I don't know what to do. And believe it or not, someone will call. I'll pick up something. I'll see something, you know. And that's how I make it with this dissertation. You know, and I'm an advocate for therapy. As a therapist, I'm an advocate for therapy. I have therapy every Monday. Every Monday, 8:00. I don't miss. And if something come up, I text her. And I'm like, hey, I need to talk. In my therapy, I treat my therapy sessions just like people treat putting gas in their car. Because in this stage, in this phase, I just realized that the reason why I've had my chapters for I don't know how long, the reason why I didn't finish is because my grandmother wouldn't be there. Here it is, another milestone. She's not going to be here. So although I was writing and I'm like, and people are like, aren't you finishing? Girl, you should be finished by now. It's not that easy. So the 2 people that really encouraged me, and I finally figured that out. Like, I finally verbally said it maybe a couple of weeks ago. And I was talking to my therapist and I said, what does it feel like to cross the finish line and you don't have your cheerleaders there?